Thanks, Jeremy. Everybody hear me okay? Just want to make sure. I'll take that as a yes.
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, I'm Gary Biddle. I'm the research director at the CIPHER Foundation, and the topic of this panel is COVID-19 and longitudinal surveys. We are the last panel of a great conference, and we have 4 very good speakers and papers to wrap things up. From an administrative perspective, the usual, you could put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them, or you can raise your hand, your actual hand or your little yellow hand, and we'll try to get to you. But what we'll do is after each speaker, we'll just have questions of clarification, and then we'll have more substantive questions during a brief Q&A at the end of the panel. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker who, Nick, are you on the line? Just want to make sure.
Yeah, all good. Can you hear me okay?
Yep. So Nick Biddle is Associate Director of the Australian National University Centre for Social Research and Methods. He is the head of the Methods and Survey Program in the Centre and lead researcher for Policy Experiments Lab. He is currently a fellow of the Tax Transfer Policy Institute. And with that, Nick, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And I'll do my best to share the screen without any issues. That's working okay?
Yep, it looks good.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, look, thanks, Gary, for the introduction. And I'll get straight into it, given the time constraints. So what we're focusing on this paper is combining some geographic level measures of COVID outcomes, cases, and the Oxford Stringency Index, which I'll define in a second, to understand 2 things. One, which I'm going to focus on mostly today, is on survey participation. So to what extent does variation at the local level in COVID outcomes and policy responses impact on someone's willingness to participate in a probability-based longitudinal survey. And then also we'll touch a little bit on the relationship with wellbeing outcomes, but mostly I'll focus on the participation question. So not surprising, there's been a huge increase in the demand for survey or tracking data during the COVID period. And I guess one of the concerns for us throughout has been the extent to which the representativeness of those samples has either stayed constant over the COVID period or more specifically has been impacted by kind of changes in outcomes at the local level or at the national level. So if what is going on in the local area is impacting on participation, then kind of the national level estimates either need to be adjusted to take that into account, or we may need to change the way in which we undertake our sampling for the surveys. But also, we're also interested in more substantive questions, which is to what extent does that variation impact on people's outcomes? So I think there's been some presentations here on the Life in Australia panel, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. That's essentially what our surveys run on. The Life in Australia panel is conducted by the Social Research Centre, and at the ANU, which partners with the Social Research Centre, we run surveys every couple of months on the panel. So it's adult population, has online and offline sample, English speaking only, probability recruited, and we link longitudinally our respondents. So the most recent fieldwork period was the 17th to the 30th of January, about 3,500 completes. And the important thing from our perspective is it varies a little bit, but between about 2/3 and 80% wave by wave linkage. For our surveys, not each wave of the panel, but for our surveys, a reasonably high longitudinal linkage, but not perfect. And what we're concerned about is making sure that those who participate in each wave, that there's no biases. It's a pretty standard survey concerns. So how do we measure kind of local variation in COVID outcomes? Well, we use cases per 1,000 people. That's pretty standard, so I'm not going to go into that. But another project within the centre is working on the Oxford Blavatnik School of Government stringency measure. So most of you will be familiar with the stringency measure, which essentially varies from 0 to 100 and captures at the national level the extent to which COVID-19 specific policies are having restrictions on people's day-to-day lives. That's a gross simplification, but that's essentially what it's capturing. At the national level, we have about 180 countries as part of the data collection. At the national level, the most stringent measure is what's taken to be the level of stringency for that country. So if you have 50 jurisdictions, like in the US, or 8 in Australia, if one of them has very, very strict COVID measures and another has and the rest have very little, then the country still is indicated as having very strict COVID responses. But in addition to other countries, Australia, we're working on a subnational measure to get a more local measure of the stringency. And as you can see here, this is a comparison between the US and Australia. Higher values, more stringent. And you can see quite substantial variation through time, but also points in time in Australia or in the US where you have very high stringency, but most parts of the country are actually experiencing very little, very few restrictions. So this is a slightly more geographically broken down stringency measure. Dark blue is the greater stringency, light blue is essentially no restrictions, and gray is our missing data. So at the moment, we've essentially coded for all states and territories from the start of 2021 through to the present, and for some states and territories, we're back through to 2020. And as you can see, we have 8 states and territories in Australia. Some, Victoria in particular, has had quite a number of periods of quite strict policy responses. Others, New South Wales and the ACT, have periods of very low and very high. And then you have jurisdictions like Western Australia or Tasmania, where you've had very few restrictions, apart from the ability to travel to those states. It's not by coincidence that Western Australia has been called the Hermit Kingdom for the last year or so. Very hard to get in. Once you're in, you can pretty much do whatever you want. So what we've got at the moment is a geographic breakdown for the larger states, or for all states and territories apart from the ACT, which is essentially just the capital city, Canberra. We've got it broken down by the capital city and then the rest of that jurisdiction. And there's ongoing work to have a lower geography. But at this point in time, we have 15 geographies with a level of stringency for each day, which we can then link to our the surveys which we've run, and also linked to the geography of those who do participate in the survey and don't participate in the survey. So I'll work through just in kind of summary terms the key findings. I'll focus on the participation, talk a little bit about what we're still working on, and then with the few minutes or the small time I have left, I'll just touch on some of the more substantive relationships. So our method is essentially our population of interest is those who are in the January 2020 wave of data collection. So we have pre-COVID baseline data for these people. We then look at the probability of undertaking each wave of data collection for those who are invited to participate. So we have 5 waves of data collection where we have stringency values. So January 2021, April 2021, August, October, and January 2022. In addition, we have controls for the number of waves which a person completed over the initial part of the COVID period where we don't have the stringency values. And also we use wave-specific dummies. And as a test, we use some individual level controls as well. So our main finding using a random effects probit model is that a higher stringency index value, so greater restrictions on activities, is associated with a higher probability of survey completion. So essentially those parts of the country which are most impacted by COVID have a greater level of participation in that particular wave of data collection. So the effect size is moderate, but important enough to care about. So in the survey, which had the greatest range of stringency values, participation ranges from 0.7 with the lowest value to 0.75. So we're, in terms of ongoing work, looking at the extent to which our functional form affects the relationship. It doesn't appear to be, including stringency values going back to prior to 2021, and also looking at recruitment to the panel, not just participation. Finally, stringency also is associated with well-being outcomes, not surprisingly, and our initial findings suggest also associated with vaccine uptake, and also variation in the stringency measured by whether you are or not vaccinated is also associated with vaccine uptake. So I'll leave it there and then hand it over to Gary for any clarifying questions, and then pick it up at the discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but does anybody have any clarification questions for Nick right now? Okay. I'm not seeing any, but thanks to Nick for delivering that at, I believe it's 6 a.m. on Saturday morning in Australia. So thanks for getting up.